May 23, 1939, 0740 hours, 47 miles southeast of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The pencil trembled in Lieutenant Oliver Naquin's hand as he marked the dive log, recording what should have been routine. A test dive, the 19th successful descent for the newest submarine in the United States Navy fleet, the USS Squalus, 310 feet of cutting-edge naval technology commissioned just 2 months earlier. Everything indicated readiness for a safe dive. Naquin stood at the diving control station in the control room, watching his crew execute their duties with precision. At age 35, the Louisiana native had earned his reputation as a strict disciplinarian. Every action his sailors took while diving was crucial. A single mistake in these iron coffins could doom them all. Submarining in 1939 remained what sailors grimly called the coffin service. Between 1921 and 1938, 825 men had died in 18 submarines from various countries. Heroic rescue attempts had always failed. 63 feet into their descent, a voice cracked through the intercom from the engine room. The words that would haunt Naquin for the rest of his life. "Take her up. The induction's open." Seawater sprayed throughout the aft compartments. Naquin's training took over instantly. Close all watertight hatches. The massive steel doors slammed shut throughout the submarine, sealing men into their compartments, some to safety, others to death. The forward compartments where Naquin stood would become a tomb or a sanctuary. The answer depended on men who at that moment had no idea the Squalus had just sunk. Within minutes, the submarine settled keel down on the Atlantic Ocean floor, 240 feet beneath the surface. 4 compartments flooded, 26 men dead, drowned in the ice-cold water that had poured through the failed engine air induction valve. In the forward compartments, 33 men remained alive, 32 crew members and 1 civilian. Naval architect Harold Preble, who had been overseeing the submarine's test dive performance. The surviving men found themselves in 3 forward compartments, separated by watertight doors. The control room held Lieutenant Naquin and most of the officers. The forward torpedo room contained sailors who had been preparing equipment. The forward battery compartment housed others. They huddled in darkness as the temperature dropped. Ice began forming on the bulkheads. The submarine's interior, normally kept at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeted toward freezing as the Atlantic's 34-degree water leached heat through the steel hull. The toxic air caused some to vomit. Carbon dioxide levels rose with each breath. The chemical carbon dioxide absorbent canisters could only do so much. Some men developed splitting headaches, others felt dizzy and disoriented. The chlorine gas from seawater contaminating the battery cells added another danger. Sailors worked frantically to isolate the batteries and prevent a catastrophic explosion. Their quick action saved lives even as the air quality deteriorated. Naquin ordered his men to stay calm, to lie down, to try to rest, not to talk. They needed to preserve their strength and conserve the limited air. He calculated they could last 48 hours if they didn't use too much oxygen. The men lay on the cold deck, wrapped in whatever clothing and blankets they could find. Some prayed silently. Others thought of their families. Some kept checking watches, counting the hours. Others tried to keep spirits up with quiet jokes, though voices trembled. The Squalus had missed her scheduled communication check. 1 hour passed, then another. At Portsmouth Naval Base, Commander Cyrus Cole realized something was catastrophically wrong. He ordered an immediate and massive rescue attempt. The USS Sculpin, the Squalus's sister ship, was dispatched to search for the missing submarine. But there was a problem that would prove nearly fatal. The Squalus's last transmitted coordinates were several miles from her true location. The Sculpin searched the wrong area for hours. As darkness fell on May 23rd, the families of 59 men waited for news. Wives, mothers, children, they gathered at the Portsmouth Naval Base, their faces etched with fear. The women stood together trying to comfort each other. They helped organize food and coffee for the growing crowd. In the submarine community, everyone knew the grim statistics. No crew had ever been rescued from a depth greater than 20 feet. At 240 feet, the Squalus crew was beyond any proven rescue capability. The submarine's designers had anticipated this nightmare. Built into the Squalus were emergency systems that now represented the only hope for the trapped men. Naquin ordered the release of a marker buoy attached to a telephone cable. On the side of the buoy, lettering declared, "Submarine sunk here. Telephone inside." The buoy broke the surface after midnight. The Sculpin's lookout spotted smoke signals at 040 hours. On May 24th, then they found the bright yellow buoy bobbing in the choppy Atlantic waters. Inside was the telephone that rang directly to the submarine. Lieutenant John Nichols of the Squalus grabbed the receiver and quickly conveyed their dire situation: -30-3, men alive in the forward compartments, 26 dead in the aft sections, 240 feet down, air running out. Then he went to get Lieutenant Naquin took the phone and greeted the Sculpin's captain, his voice steady despite the circumstances. But he had only seconds to speak before the cable snapped, cutting off communication. The trapped men were alone again in their iron tomb. Yet something critical had changed. The Navy now knew exactly where the squalors lay. They knew men were alive, and they knew they had less than 48 hours to accomplish what had never been done before: rescue. Submariners from 240 feet beneath the ocean surface. 2,000 miles south in Washington, at the Navy Yard, a phone rang in the office of Lieutenant Commander Charles Momsen, the call that would define his legacy. Momsen, nicknamed Swede, had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. A moment he prayed would never come, but knew was inevitable. Momsen had graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1919. 1 year early due to World War I, his path to submarine service began in 1921 when he entered the submarine school in New London, Connecticut. Within 2 years, he had his first command. The submarine S-1, September 25, 1925, changed everything. The USS S-51, sister ship to Momsen's S-1, collided with the freighter City of Rome near Block Island. She sank in 130 feet of water. Momsen was ordered to take his submarine to search for the crippled vessel. He found the oil slick marking the spot, but without sonar, there was no way to locate the submarine on the bottom, no way to reach the trapped men. All 33 crew members died slowly as their air ran out. Momsen stood on the deck of his submarine, knowing his friends were dying below him, and felt utterly helpless. That feeling sparked an obsession. He began working on rescue equipment during his off-duty hours. First came a one-man breathing device, an oblong rubber bag that recycled exhaled air, using soda lime to remove carbon dioxide. The press enthusiastically received the device and dubbed it the Momsen lung. Between June 1929 and September 1932, Momsen developed and personally tested the lung at a depth of 200 feet. The Navy awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal in 1929. But Momsen knew the lung had severe limitations. It required the submariner to make a free ascent through water that could kill through pressure, temperature, or the bends. What he really wanted was a way to bring rescue to the submarine itself. He conceived a diving bell that could be lowered to a submarine in distress, mate with an escape hatch, and allow trapped submariners to climb inside without ever entering the water. In 1926, Momsen proposed the adoption of a diving bell for submarine rescue purposes to the Bureau of Construction and Repair. His drawings were reviewed and returned with a single word stamped across them: impractical. Then, in December 1927, came another disaster. The USS S-4 sank off Cape Cod after being accidentally rammed by a Coast Guard destroyer. The submarine bottomed in 110 feet of water. 6 sailors in the forward torpedo room were initially alive. They tapped signals on the hull to Navy divers working in the brutal cold and tangled wreckage. The tapping continued for days. Divers could hear the men inside begging for rescue. But a storm forced a stop to the salvage attempts. On December 24, all 40 men aboard the S-4 died. The public was outraged. The Navy was humiliated. And Charles Momsen was more determined than ever. Momsen returned to his diving bell idea in 1930. He built a prototype using a watertight aircraft hangar from his old submarine, the S-1. He tested it off Key West, Florida. The initial results were discouraging. Momsen found the bell unstable. It tipped, it leaked. But before he could make the necessary modifications, the Navy ordered him to the Bureau of Construction and Repair to teach submariners how to use the Momsen lung. He incorporated all of Momsen's recommended changes plus additional improvements: a floor bulkhead to prevent tipping, a pneumatic winch for better control, a pressure seal allowing direct transfer of survivors to the diving bell in a dry environment, and a rubber gasket embedded into a circular groove on the bottom edge, creating a watertight seal when pressed against the flat mounting ring welded around submarine hatches. When the redesigned diving bell was completed in late 1930, the Navy introduced it as the McCann Submarine Rescue Chamber. Through the early 1930s, McCann Rescue Chambers were built and distributed to submarine rescue ships. The USS S4, raised and reconditioned after the disaster, became a floating test laboratory. Momsen went to sea aboard her to conduct practical experiments and training with the rescue chambers. But by 1939, despite years of training, the McCann Rescue Chamber had never been used in an actual emergency. It remained theoretical, unproven. Some in the Navy brass still considered it unnecessary. Now, at 0400 hours on May 24, 1939, Lieutenant Commander Momsen received the call that would prove either his vindication or his greatest failure. Momsen grabbed his diving equipment and assembled a team of the Navy's best divers. They jammed into a convoy of cars escorted by local and state police. The convoy screamed up the coast from Washington to Portsmouth, a distance of over 400 miles. They were traveling so fast that the police escort couldn't keep up as they passed through Boston. Red lights were ignored. Intersections were blocked for their passage. Momsen and his team arrived at Portsmouth at 0415 hours on May 24th. They had made the journey in record time. But would they arrive in time to save the 33 men trapped beneath the Atlantic? Meanwhile, the submarine rescue ship USS Falcon was racing north from New London, Connecticut, 200 miles of ocean separating her from the trapped men. The Falcon was a 187-foot minesweeper, converted for submarine rescue operations. On her deck sat the untested McCann Rescue Chamber that Momsen and McCann had spent years developing. The chamber stood 10 feet high and 7 feet wide, weighing 21,600 pounds. Two compartments, upper and lower, were separated by a floor bulkhead. The lower compartment would mate with a submarine hatch. The upper would carry survivors to the surface. The Falcon moored over the Squalus position on the morning of May 24th. The marker buoy bobbed nearby, its telephone cable severed but its position marking the submarine's grave. Commander Momsen took charge of the operation. His first task was to send divers down to confirm the submarine's exact location and attach guide wires that would allow the rescue chamber to descend directly to the escape hatch. The divers who volunteered for the descent knew the dangers better than anyone. 240 feet represented the extreme limit of diving operations in 1939. At that depth, water pressure exceeded 100 pounds per square inch, 7 times normal atmospheric pressure. Every breath required effort. The human body was not designed to endure such crushing force. Divers had to suppress panic as their chests compressed and lungs strained against the weight. The Atlantic water hovered just above freezing, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite the insulating layers of their canvas suits, body heat fled rapidly. Hypothermia could incapacitate a man within minutes if his suit flooded. Lead boots and brass helmets protected them but also conducted cold directly into the body. Hands went numb. Fingers stiffened. Simple tasks like tying knots became nearly impossible. The worst danger, though, was nitrogen narcosis, the rapture of the deep. At depth, nitrogen dissolved into the blood and brain tissue, producing effects like intoxication. Judgment faltered. Divers grew euphoric, hallucinated, or ripped off their helmets, convinced they could breathe water. Nitrogen narcosis struck around 100 feet for most men. At 200, it was severe. At 240, divers operated in a dreamlike haze. Every action had to be rehearsed mentally, because in the fog of narcosis they might forget what they were doing. Momsen's team had pioneered the use of helium-oxygen mixtures that reduced the effect. Replacing nitrogen with helium allowed better mental clarity, but 240 feet remained deadly. Rapid ascent risked the ben's nitrogen bubbles forming in blood and tissue, causing agony, paralysis, and death. Divers had to rise in slow stages, making decompression stops at fixed depths to purge gas from their systems. Yet in an emergency, when air ran low or equipment failed, those stops might be skipped, forcing them to choose between drowning below or dying of decompression sickness above. Visibility was almost nil. The New England Atlantic carried sediment and plankton that scattered light. Even powerful underwater lamps illuminated only inches ahead. Divers navigated by feel, following guide ropes and the submarine's cold steel skin. Currents could slam a diver into the hull or tangle him in cables. One misstep and he might be trapped beneath the submarine, lost in the infinite black. The guide wires were lifelines. Without them a diver could swim in circles until his air ran out. Chief torpedoman Martin Sabitsky volunteered to go first. He had trained for years in deep diving techniques, but training and reality were worlds apart. If Sabitsky failed to attach the guide wires properly, the rescue chamber might not mate with the hatch, and all 33 men would perish. The weight of that knowledge pressed as heavily as the ocean above him. He donned the heavy canvas suit, brass helmet, and lead boots. Air hoses and lines were checked, rechecked, then sealed. At 1100 hours, Sabitsky descended into blackness. Inside the Squalus, the 33 survivors heard the faint hollow clang of lead boots on the hull. They cheered weakly. Someone had found them. Sabitsky worked in total darkness, his hands numb from cold as he attached the guide wires to the submarine's forward escape hatch. The hatch had been fitted with a flat mounting ring, a modification installed across the fleet specifically for the McCann chamber. His movements were slow, deliberate. The nitrogen narcosis crept in, a dreamlike euphoria he fought to ignore. He forced focus one cable, then another, a third for redundancy. He pulled hard to test each line. Satisfied, he signaled for ascent. Rising took longer than descent as he paused for decompression, but he reached the surface safely. The path was ready. At 11:30 hours, the McCann Rescue Chamber began its first operational descent. Not a drill, this was real. The chamber hung from a steel cable connected to a winch aboard the Falcon. As it descended through green-black water, the two operators inside felt increasing pressure. The steel walls groaned and creaked. Inside were torpedoman's mate, John Mahalski, and gunner's mate, Walter Harmon, both trained extensively in chamber operations. They carried supplies the men below desperately needed: hot pea soup, sandwiches, milk, blankets, flashlights, and medical gear. These simple items represented more than sustenance. They were proof the world above had not forgotten. The descent took nearly an hour. Mihalowski and Harmon monitored depth, pressure, and ballast. They kept up steady communication with the Falcon. Every few feet, they adjusted buoyancy by bleeding air or taking on water. Too much air, and the chamber might rocket to the surface. Too little, and it could slam into the hull. They sought perfect neutrality, allowing the cable to guide them smoothly down the wires. Sabitsky had fixed at 240 feet. The chamber made gentle contact with the survivors inside heard the thud and cheered. Their throats were raw from toxic air. Their voices cracked, but hope surged. Mihalowski and Harmon now faced the most delicate step, aligning the chamber perfectly over the escape hatch. A few inches off center, and the rubber gasket would fail to seal, flooding both chamber and submarine. Divers outside confirmed alignment by touch, guiding them in the dark. Once centered, a downhaul cable was attached to a bail welded over the hatch. A diver, working by feel, connected it. When tightened, it would draw the chamber flush against the ring. Slowly, carefully, the operators winched the chamber down. The rubber gasket compressed, hopefully forming a watertight seal. Now came the moment of truth. The lower compartment had to be blown dry with compressed air. If the seal leaked, seawater would pour in faster than they could pump it out. Mihalowski opened the air valve. A hiss filled the chamber. Water drained slowly. 6 inches, 1 foot, 2 feet the seal held. Pressure gauges climbed 40, 50, 60 pounds per square inch, matching the Squalus interior. Once pressures equalized, hatches could open. Mihalowski unlatched the chamber's bottom hatch and saw the submarine's hatch below. He opened it, and pale, exhausted faces stared up. Men who had spent nearly a day in freezing darkness, certain they would die, now saw salvation. Mihalowski passed down hot soup and food. One man took a sip and croaked, "Where the hell are the napkins?" The weak laughter that followed broke the tension. They would live. Lieutenant Naquin chose the weakest men to ascend first, those sick from chlorine gas, hypothermia, or carbon dioxide. 7 climbed into the chamber's lower compartment. The submarine's hatch closed, the chamber hatch sealed, and air was blown into ballast tanks to give lift. At 1300 hours, the chamber began its slow ascent. Inside, survivors huddled together in silence, some praying, some weeping. After 39 hours of waiting for death, they were rising toward life. At 1330 hours, the chamber broke the surface, the first successful deep submarine rescue in history. 7 men were lifted onto the Falcon's deck, wrapped in blankets and checked by doctors. Word spread instantly through the fleet and ashore. Cheers erupted at Portsmouth Naval Base. Wives embraced, some fainted in relief. The chamber worked, they could be saved. There was no time to celebrate. 26 men remained below. The weather worsened, seas growing rough. Chief Machinist's mate William Badders, the most experienced chamber operator, knew the equipment intimately. The window for rescue was closing. He decided to risk bringing up 8 men on the second trip instead of 7. The chamber was built for 7 + 2 operators, but Badders judged it could handle the extra weight. When he surfaced, Momsen cautioned, "You brought out too many this trip." Then, seeing the logic, added, "Do it again." The third descent began at 1500 hours. 9 more men rose to safety by evening. The chamber was overloaded. 9 survivors, plus 2 operators, but it held. By 1800 hours, only 7 men remained in the Squalus, Naquin, and 6 others. The final descent started at 1841 hours. The chamber reached the submarine, sealed properly, and the last group climbed inside. Naquin, the last to leave, sealed the hatch behind him, taking one last look at his command. As the chamber ascended, disaster struck. The steel cable fouled in the winch, twisting and jamming. The chamber stalled 100 feet below the surface. If the cable snapped, it would plunge to the bottom and be crushed. On the Falcon, Momsen and his team worked desperately. Divers went down in darkness to free the cable. Chief Torpedoman Walter Squire descended first, locating the twisted wire and trying to straighten it. He managed partial success, but jarred the chamber violently. Inside, men were thrown about, some injured. Jesse Duncan went next. He found the cable but became entangled himself, his air hose wrapping around the steel. Nearly out of air, delirious from narcosis, he barely reached the surface alive and collapsed unconscious. Another diver tried and failed. The cable was too damaged. Inside the chamber, the men had now been suspended in darkness for over 3 hours, air growing foul. Momsen made a fateful decision. They would manually haul the 21,600-pound chamber by hand. 6 men on deck, Momsen among them, grabbed the cable and heaved. It did not move. Blow ballast for 15 seconds. He ordered down the line. The men inside released air to lighten the load. Pull. The chamber rose inches. Blow again. They repeated the process. Blow, pull, rest inch by inch, the chamber creeping upward. More sailors joined. 10, then 15. Pulling in rhythm, as Momsen shouted cadence, 50 feet, 40, 30. The cable creaked under strain but held. At 0030 hours on May 25, 39 hours after the sinking, the chamber broke the surface. Lieutenant Oliver Naquin and his 6 shipmates climbed out onto the Falcon's deck. All 33 survivors had been rescued. For trips, 13 hours of continuous operation, 240 feet below the sea. The device born from Momsen's obsession had achieved the impossible. News spread worldwide. Newspapers hailed the miracle at sea. Families on shore erupted in joy. The Squalus disaster had been transformed into one of the greatest rescues in naval history. But the story of the Squalus was far from over. 26 men still lay entombed in the flooded aft compartments, and the Navy decided to attempt something that seemed even more impossible than the rescue. They would raise the submarine from the ocean floor. The salvage effort that followed would become one of the most complex and dangerous engineering operations ever attempted. For 4 months, divers worked in brutal conditions, descending hundreds of times to 240 feet to prepare the wreck for lifting. Each dive risked decompression sickness, nitrogen narcosis, and hypothermia. The water was black and near freezing, and the wreck's twisted structure made movement perilous. Still, the work pressed on. The plan was daring. Large steel pontoons would be lowered and attached to the hull. Cables threaded through specially drilled holes. Once secured, compressed air would be pumped into the pontoons, providing the buoyant force needed to lift the submarine from the seafloor. Every calculation had to be exact. A single mistake could cause the pontoons to break free, or the submarine to roll and sink again. Charles Momsen directed the operation with unrelenting precision, using lessons learned from the rescue to guide the salvage. The pontoons were enormous, each capable of generating thousands of pounds of lift. Divers attached them along the hull, forward and aft, securing them with cables and clamps. As they worked, they battled fatigue, cold, and the ever-present danger of the bends. Some divers suffered permanent injuries, but none gave up. The Navy's determination matched that of the men who had been trapped below months earlier. Slowly, methodically, the Squalus was prepared for her ascent. On September 13, 1939, after months of tireless effort, the submarine broke the surface. Crowds gathered on nearby ships and at Portsmouth Naval Yard to witness history. The raised vessel, cradled by pontoons and streaming water from every opening, was towed carefully back to shore. For many, it was both a moment of triumph and one of mourning. A Navy Board of Inquiry later determined that a mechanical failure in the operating gear of the engineer induction valve had caused the disaster. The valve, which should have closed automatically when the submarine submerged, had remained open. Seawater poured through the 36-inch opening, flooding the aft compartments in minutes. The investigation fully exonerated Lieutenant Naquin and his crew. His calm leadership had preserved the lives of the 33 survivors. The Navy immediately implemented design changes, replacing similar valves across the fleet with quick-closing flapper types to prevent a recurrence. The tragedy, though devastating, drove innovations that would save countless lives in future years. 25 bodies were recovered from the wreck. They were found in the flooded compartments where they had fought to survive, some thrown against bulkheads by the torrent, others near watertight doors, overcome before they could escape. All had died within minutes. The 26th man was lost to the sea when a hatch was opened during salvage. The recovered sailors were buried with full military honors in Kittery, Maine, in ceremonies that drew thousands of mourners. Their graves, arranged in neat rows, became a permanent reminder of the price of submarine service. The Squalus itself was repaired, refitted, and recommissioned under a new name, USS. The rechristening took place on February 9, 1940, marking her rebirth from tragedy. The Sailfish would go on to serve with distinction throughout World War II. Under successive commanders, she completed 9 war patrols in the Pacific. Departing Portsmouth in January 1941, she sailed for the Philippines, where she was already on station when war broke out. Over the course of the conflict, she sank 7 enemy vessels and damaged 8 more. Her most famous victory came on December 4, 1943, when she torpedoed and sank the Japanese aircraft carrier Chayo. The attack carried a cruel irony. Unbeknownst to the Sailfish crew, Chayo was transporting American prisoners of war survivors of the USS Sculpin, the same sister ship that had searched for the Squalus 4 years earlier. When Sculpin was sunk by Japanese depth charges in November 1943, 21 survivors were taken prisoner and placed aboard Chayo. Only one lived through both disasters. The Sailfish earned 9 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation for her wartime service. Some of the men who had been rescued from the Squalus volunteered to serve aboard her, returning to the very same submarine that had nearly been their grave. Their courage was extraordinary, a testament to their faith in the improved safety and their devotion to duty. Lieutenant Oliver Naquin, though fully exonerated, never again commanded a submarine. The Navy recognized the toll the disaster had taken. He served instead aboard surface ships, later becoming navigator of the heavy cruiser USS New Orleans. At the Battle of Tassafaronga in November 1942, the New Orleans was struck by a Japanese torpedo that sheared off her bow. Once again, Naquin's calm leadership saved his ship. He rose to the rank of Rear Admiral before retiring in 1955. After 34 years of service, Naquin lived until 1989, dying at 80. Throughout his life, he deflected praise for the Squalus rescue, always crediting his crew. "My officers and men acted instinctively and calmly," he said. "There were no expressions of fear and no complaints of the bitter cold. Never in my remaining life do I expect to witness so true an exemplification of comradeship and brotherly love." Charles Momsen continued his distinguished naval career through World War II. His expertise extended far beyond rescue operations. During the early years of the war, American submarines suffered torpedo failures, hits that failed to explode. Momsen led the investigation that uncovered defects in the Mark VI exploder mechanism. His modifications, known among torpedomen as the Pearl Harbor Fix, restored torpedo reliability. Later, as commander of Submarine Squadron 2 and then Squadron 4, Momsen pioneered the Wolfpack doctrine, organizing submarines into coordinated attack groups operating deep in enemy waters. Aboard the submarine Zero, he led the first American Wolfpack into the East China Sea, sinking 5 Japanese ships totaling over 38,000 tons and damaging 8 more. For this, he received the Navy Cross. Momsen's final wartime command was the battleship USS South Dakota, which he led in support of the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Under his command, the South Dakota's massive 16-inch guns delivered devastating shore bombardments. Momsen retired in 1955 as a vice admiral after 36 years of service. He died of cancer on May 25, 1967, exactly 28 years to the day after the Squalus rescue was completed. It was a fitting end for the man whose innovations had rewritten the fate of submariners. The Momsen lung, which he had designed decades earlier, saved its first combat lives in 1944 when the USS Tang sank in the East China Sea after being struck by her own torpedo. 13 men used the lung to attempt a free ascent from 180 feet. 5 survived to be captured by the Japanese. Though the others perished, the escape proved that Momsen's invention worked. Modern submarine rescue systems still follow the principles he established. Pressurized chambers that mate with escape hatches, allowing survivors to transfer without exposure to the sea. Modern rescue modules can reach depths of 2,000 feet and carry up to 18 people. Every submarine in the US Navy now carries features that trace their origins to Momsen's work escape trunks, buoyed telephone lines, and external hatch rings for rescue devices. The innovations born of the Squalus tragedy transformed not only submarine safety but also deep-sea diving. The use of helium-oxygen mixtures, developed during the rescue, revolutionized commercial and military diving alike. Salvage techniques pioneered in raising the Squalus external pontoons, buoyancy control, stage descents became the foundation for modern recovery operations. In 1985, on the 46th anniversary of the rescue, surviving Squalus crewmen gathered again in Portsmouth. Over 20 attended, joined by children and grandchildren, who owed their lives to the events of that May morning. They visited the cemetery in Kittery, standing quietly before the graves of their shipmates. Some wept, others stared silently at the sea that had nearly taken them. Among them was Alan Carl Bryson, the last survivor, who lived until December 1, 2008, dying at 91, 72 years after the rescue that saved him. He often spoke to naval groups about the Squalus, always ending with the same words: "The men who saved us were heroes." But the real hero was Swede. He never gave up preparing for a disaster he hoped would never happen. When it did, he was ready. History belongs to those who persist. Charles Momsen spent years refining ideas others dismissed as impractical, risking ridicule and his own life to test them. When the day came, his inventions turned tragedy into triumph. The Squalus lies at the meeting point of death and deliverance, a story of courage, ingenuity, and endurance. 26 men died in her steel tomb, but 33 lived because one man refused to accept that submariners were doomed. When the call came, Swede Momsen and his team achieved what the world believed impossible. They brought every living soul to the surface and proved that hope, preparation, and human resolve could triumph even in the crushing darkness of the deep.